Do you really think you can do better, little girl?
Just watch me.
3 minutes and 47 seconds. That's exactly how long it took for Melody Brooks to completely destroy Adrian Stone's world. And he felt every note as her fingers transformed his silent piano into liquid poetry. Have you ever had someone shatter every assumption you've ever held about them in under 4 minutes? Well, Adrian did. And you can't imagine how it felt to watch a woman he'd dismissed as just the help play Liszt's most challenging piece with such breathtaking mastery that it left him questioning everything he thought he knew about worth, talent, and love. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video and comment where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let me take you back to where this story really began, that stormy Tuesday morning when two souls from different worlds were about to collide over a piano that had been silent for far too long. The alarm pierced through the pre-dawn silence of the Nob Hill mansion at exactly 6:47 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past 3 years. Adrian Stone's eyes snapped open, his hand already reaching to silence the device before the second chime could disturb the carefully orchestrated quiet of his 12,000-square-foot fortress of solitude. At 34, Adrian possessed the kind of sharp-featured handsomeness that photographers loved and people found intimidating. Steel-gray eyes that seemed to calculate net worth at first glance, perfectly styled dark hair that never dared fall out of place, and a jawline that could cut glass. This morning, he wore charcoal silk pajamas that cost more than most people's monthly expenses, though such comparisons never crossed his mind. Money had ceased being a measuring stick long ago. It was simply the air he breathed. He swung his legs over the edge of his California king bed, bare feet touching Italian marble that had been heated to precisely 72 degrees. The bedroom stretched around him like a monument to emptiness, all clean lines, muted grays, and strategic lighting that highlighted expensive art while casting no warmth whatsoever. A single photograph sat on his nightstand, his mother at the piano, her fingers frozen mid-song, her smile captured just months before cancer stole both her music and her life. Adrian picked up his phone, scrolling through overnight emails from Tokyo, London, Singapore. His tech company, Nexus Dynamics, operated in 17 countries, and problems never slept. A server issue in Germany. A product launch delay in Australia. A competitor trying to poach his head of development. Each crisis felt like background noise, easily solved with the right combination of money and pressure. He padded to his private gym, a glass-enclosed space overlooking the San Francisco Bay where morning fog rolled in like gray silk. 45 minutes of precise exercise. Cardio calculated to maintain his heart rate in the optimal zone, weights lifted with mechanical precision. No music. No distractions. Just the rhythm of his breathing and the distant hum of a city waking up far below his hilltop kingdom. At 8:15 a.m. sharp, Adrian emerged from his marble-lined shower, water streaming down a physique maintained with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to everything else. He selected a navy Tom Ford suit, white shirt pressed to perfection, silver cufflinks that had belonged to his grandfather. Every detail calculated to project power, control, untouchability. The morning ritual continued in his kitchen, if you could call the sterile expanse of granite and stainless steel a kitchen. More laboratory than heart of a home, it gleamed under LED lighting that revealed not a single smudge or sign of actual use. Adrian consumed his breakfast with the enthusiasm of a man taking medicine. Steel-cut oats, fresh berries, black coffee from beans that cost $50 a pound. Nutrition optimized. Flavor irrelevant. He ate standing at the granite island, reviewing market reports on his tablet, occasionally glancing through the massive windows that framed the Golden Gate Bridge like a postcard he'd grown tired of viewing. The house surrounded him with its 15 rooms of designer furniture and original artwork, each space perfectly decorated and completely empty of any sign that a human being actually lived there. The silence was broken only by the soft chime of his phone. His assistant's daily briefing, board meeting at 10, lunch with potential investors at noon, conference call with the London office at 3. A life structured down to the minute, productive and profitable and utterly hollow. Adrian straightened his tie and collected his briefcase, preparing to descend into his garage where 3 cars waited. A Tesla for efficiency, a Porsche for the rare moments he pretended to enjoy driving, and a Mercedes for client meetings. He paused at the foot of the grand staircase, his eyes drawn to the one room he never entered anymore, the music room. Through the open doorway, he could see the Steinway grand piano that dominated the space, its ebony surface reflecting the morning light. 10 years of dust had probably accumulated on the keys. He couldn't remember the last time he'd touched them. Music belonged to a different version of himself, one that had died along with his mother when he was 16. What would she think of him now? The thought flickered through his mind before he crushed it with practiced efficiency. Success was what mattered. Power. Control. Not the sentimental weakness that had once made him believe beauty and art meant something more than market value. Melody Brooks had been awake for 30 minutes already, sitting at the edge of her narrow bed in the small room she rented from Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who charged fair rates and asked no questions. At 28, Melody possessed a quiet elegance that expensive clothes couldn't buy, warm brown eyes that held depths of intelligence and pain, natural hair that framed her face in soft curls, and hands that moved with an unconscious grace that spoke of years of disciplined training. She wore faded jeans and a purple sweater that had seen better years but still brought out the richness of her dark skin. Practical clothes for practical work, nothing that would draw attention or suggest she'd once worn evening gowns on concert stages and received standing ovations from audiences who hung on every note she played. The room around her told the story of dreams deferred rather than abandoned. A small desk held sheet music, Chopin, Bach, Liszt, the pages worn from years of study and dreams. A few books about music theory leaned against a framed photo of her family. Her parents beaming with pride at her Juilliard acceptance, her younger brother grinning with gap-toothed joy. The photo was 3 years old, taken before medical bills and crushing debt had rewritten all their stories. Melody stood and moved to the tiny window, watching the city wake up in shades of gray and gold. Somewhere across town, in those hills where the wealthy lived behind gates and gardens, her first client of the day was probably stirring in luxury she could barely imagine. Adrian Stone. She'd been cleaning his house twice a week for 8 months now, moving through his empty mansion like a ghost tending to a beautiful tomb. She'd learned things about him that his business rivals would pay millions to discover. How he ate the same breakfast every day but never seemed to taste it. How he worked 16-hour days but never appeared tired, as if ambition had replaced the need for rest. How he owned a piano that clearly cost more than she'd made in the past 2 years, yet the instrument sat silent and untouched, accumulating dust like a monument to abandoned dreams. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, a woman who'd once played Carnegie Hall as a student competition winner, now dusting the piano keys of a man who probably couldn't distinguish Beethoven from the Beatles. But irony didn't pay rent or help with her mother's medical bills or keep food on her family's table back in Oakland. Melody gathered her cleaning supplies. Microfiber cloths, specialty wood polish, glass cleaner that didn't leave streaks on those massive windows that looked out over the bay. Everything had to be perfect in Adrian Stone's world. No smudges, no dust, no signs that real human beings existed in his carefully controlled environment. She caught her reflection in the small mirror above her dresser and paused. Sometimes, for just a moment, she could see the girl she used to be, the one who'd walked onto stages with confidence, who'd believed talent and hard work could overcome any obstacle, who'd never imagined she'd be grateful for work that allowed her to hide in plain sight. Focus, Melody, she told herself, the internal voice carrying the same strength that had gotten her through 3 years of Juilliard before everything fell apart. This is temporary. Everything is temporary. She grabbed her keys and headed for her 10-year-old Honda Civic, which started on the third try and made concerning noises that she couldn't afford to investigate. The drive across the city took 45 minutes in morning traffic, carrying her from the working-class Richmond where people knew their neighbors' names to the rarefied heights of Pacific Heights where homes cost more than small countries' budgets. As she pulled up to the imposing gates of the stone mansion, Melody felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of emotional preparation. For the next 4 hours, she would move through rooms that showcased wealth beyond imagination while remaining invisible to the man who owned it all. She would dust furniture that cost more than her education, vacuum carpets that felt like clouds beneath her feet, and carefully avoid the one room that called to her soul, the music room with its silent, magnificent piano. The gate opened automatically as her car approached, recognizing the transponder Mr. Stone's assistant had provided. Melody drove up the winding driveway lined with perfectly manicured gardens that probably required a team of 5 gardeners to maintain. Cherry blossoms were in full bloom, dropping pink petals like confetti across the pristine walkways. Beautiful and untouched, like everything else in Adrian Stone's world. She parked in the service area behind the house and gathered her supplies, checking her phone for any special instructions. Nothing today. Just the usual routine, main living areas, kitchen, office if he wasn't using it, and the guest bedrooms that never hosted guests. She'd learned to move efficiently through the mansion, completing her work without disturbing the careful emptiness that seemed to be Mr. Stone's preferred state of existence. Melody used her key to enter through the service entrance, stepping into the immaculate kitchen that gleamed under the morning light. The silence hit her immediately. Not peaceful quiet, but the hollow absence of life and laughter and the small sounds that made a house a home. She'd grown up in a house where music played constantly, where her mother hummed while cooking and her father whistled while reading the newspaper. This place felt like a mausoleum dedicated to success without joy. She began her routine, moving methodically through the ground floor. Dusting surfaces that showed no fingerprints, vacuuming carpets that bore no footprints, straightening cushions that no one had disturbed. Each room was a masterpiece of interior design and a testament to the loneliness money could buy. Melody saved the music room for last, as she always did. She told herself it was because the piano required special care, but truthfully, she needed time to prepare herself emotionally. Standing in that room, surrounded by the scent of lemon oil and the morning light streaming across those untouched keys, she felt the weight of her abandoned dreams most acutely. Today, like every Tuesday and Friday for the past 8 months, she would dust Adrian Stone's piano and pretend her fingers didn't ache to dance across those keys. She would clean around the music that lived in her soul and maintain the silence that seemed to define his world. She moved toward the music room, her cleaning supplies in hand, unaware that this morning would be different. Unaware that Adrian Stone, running late due to a crisis call from his Tokyo office, was still in the house. Unaware that in exactly 12 minutes, her carefully hidden world and his perfectly controlled existence were about to collide in a way that would change everything. The stage was set. The music room waited. And somewhere in the elegant emptiness of the mansion, 2 souls who had buried their deepest selves were about to discover that some truths cannot remain silent forever. Adrian Stone stood in the doorway of his home office, phone pressed to his ear as his Tokyo team explained why their biggest client was threatening to walk away. Server crashes, missed deadlines, excuses that made his jaw clench with barely controlled frustration. He paced the marble hallway, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the stone in sharp, angry rhythms. I don't want to hear about problems, Tanaka. I want solutions. Fix it, or I'll find someone who can. He ended the call with more force than necessary, the sound echoing through the empty corridors of his mansion. The silence that followed felt oppressive, pressing against his temples like a physical weight. This house, with all its perfection and polish, suddenly felt like a beautifully appointed prison. He needed movement, distraction, something to burn off the restless energy that success couldn't seem to satisfy. Adrian rounded the corner toward his home gym, then stopped abruptly. Soft sounds drifted from the music room, the gentle whisper of cloth against wood, the careful placement of objects. Of course. Tuesday. The cleaning woman. He'd barely noticed her over the past 8 months. She arrived precisely on schedule, worked efficiently through his house, and disappeared without disturbing his carefully ordered existence. Exactly what he paid for. Invisible service from invisible people who understood their place in his world. But today, something felt different. Maybe it was his frustration with the Tokyo crisis, or the way the morning light slanted through the tall windows, but Adrian found himself walking toward the music room instead of away from it. He told himself he was simply checking on her work, ensuring his expensive piano received proper care. Through the doorway, he could see her, a woman in faded jeans and a purple sweater, moving around his Steinway Grand with an almost reverent care. She held her microfiber cloth like it was made of silk, dusting each surface with a gentleness that seemed oddly personal. There was something in her posture, the way she moved around the instrument, that struck him as different from how she cleaned everything else. "Excuse me," Adrian said, stepping into the room. The woman turned, and he found himself looking into warm brown eyes that held a depth he hadn't expected. She was prettier than he'd realized. Not magazine perfect like the women he typically encountered at charity galas and business dinners, but naturally beautiful in a way that required no enhancement. Her face showed intelligence and something else he couldn't quite identify. Sadness, maybe. Or longing. "Mr. Stone." Her voice was soft but clear, with an education that surprised him. "I'm almost finished in here. I can come back later if you need." "No, continue." He waved dismissively, moving to lean against the doorframe. "I was just curious. You seem to take special care with the piano." She resumed her dusting, but he noticed a slight tension in her shoulders. "It's a beautiful instrument. A Steinway Model D. They require specific care to maintain their finish and touch sensitivity." Adrian blinked. Most people might recognize the Steinway name, but touch sensitivity? That wasn't casual knowledge. "You know pianos?" "A little." The response was carefully neutral, but something flickered in her eyes, a guardedness that made him more curious rather than less. He pushed off from the doorframe, moving closer. The piano dominated the center of the room, its ebony surface reflecting the morning light like dark water. He hadn't touched those keys in over a decade, but suddenly he found himself remembering the weight of them beneath his fingers, the way sound could fill empty spaces and make them feel alive. "Do you play?" The question came out more abruptly than he'd intended. Her hands stilled on the piano bench she was dusting. For a moment, she didn't answer, and he thought he saw her fingers tremble slightly against the cloth. When she looked up, her expression was carefully blank. "Not really, sir. Not anymore." The anymore hung in the air between them, loaded with implications he found himself wanting to explore. But her tone suggested the conversation was closed, and he felt a familiar irritation at being dismissed. People didn't dismiss Adrian Stone. They competed for his attention, sought his approval, hung on his every word. "Pity," he said, moving to run his hand along the piano's closed lid. Dust came away on his fingers, proof of how long it had been silent. "It's a shame to have an instrument like this go unplayed. Though I suppose it takes real skill to handle Liszt or Rachmaninoff. Most people couldn't manage anything more complex than chopsticks." He saw her stiffen at the casual condescension in his tone, saw something flash in her eyes that looked almost like anger. Good. He preferred honest reactions to the careful deference he usually received. "Liszt is challenging," she said quietly, still not looking at him. "But not impossible. With proper training and dedication, most pieces are achievable." Adrian felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth. Not a pleasant expression, but one that had intimidated boardrooms full of executives. Here was an opportunity for entertainment, a brief distraction from the morning's frustrations. What harm could there be in demonstrating reality to someone who clearly needed a lesson in knowing her place? Really? He moved to the piano bench, lifting the lid to reveal the pristine ivory and ebony keys. Well then, since you seem so confident about Liszt's accessibility, perhaps you'd care to demonstrate? The woman, he realized he didn't even know her name, went very still. Her cleaning cloth hung forgotten in her hands as she stared at the revealed keyboard like it might bite her. I couldn't, Mr. Stone. I'm here to work, not to. Consider it part of your job today. His voice carried the quiet authority that had built his empire. Prove this theory about Liszt being achievable. Let's say, La Campanella. Surely someone with proper training could manage that. He watched her face carefully, expecting to see the nervous retreat he was used to when people realized they'd overstepped. La Campanella was notoriously difficult. Liszt's third etude, a piece that separated serious pianists from dilettantes. He'd chosen it specifically because it was nearly impossible for anyone without years of advanced study. But instead of backing down, something shifted in her expression. The careful servility fell away, replaced by something that looked almost like steel. She set down her cleaning cloth with deliberate precision and turned to face him fully. If I play Liszt, she said, her voice carrying a new edge, what exactly are you offering in return, Mr. Stone? The question caught him off guard. He'd expected stammering excuses, not negotiations. The woman was looking at him with those intelligent brown eyes, and he found himself oddly intrigued by her boldness. If you can actually play La Campanella, really play it, not stumble through it, I'll. He paused, considering. What could he offer someone in her position? Money seemed too crude, too obvious. Then inspiration struck, and that predatory smile returned. I'll marry you. The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down between them. He expected her to laugh, to back down, to return to her cleaning with proper humility. Instead, she studied his face for a long moment, as if measuring something he couldn't see. That's quite an offer, Mr. Stone. Her voice was steady, but he caught something underneath it. Hurt, maybe, or determination. Are you prepared for the consequences if I accept? Before he could respond, she moved to the piano bench and sat down with a grace that should have warned him. Her posture changed completely. Back straight, shoulders relaxed, hands positioned over the keys with a professional precision that made his breath catch. Melody Brooks, she said, not looking at him. Since we're making bargains, you should know my name. And then her fingers touched the keys. The first notes of La Campanella filled the room like liquid fire, each note crystal clear and perfectly placed. Adrian felt his world tilt and shift as the woman, Melody, transformed before his eyes. This wasn't stumbling through a difficult piece. This was mastery. This was artistry that belonged in concert halls, not cleaning houses. Her hands moved across the keyboard with impossible fluidity, tackling Liszt's most demanding passages with a kind of technical brilliance that took decades to develop. The music soared and danced, filling every corner of his sterile mansion with life and passion he'd forgotten could exist. Adrian stood frozen, watching her fingers navigate the treacherous runs and leaps that had defeated him even during his childhood lessons. She made it look effortless, but he could see the years of training in every gesture, the profound musicality that turned mere notes into something transcendent. This wasn't possible. The woman who cleaned his house, who he'd dismissed as the help, was playing with the skill of a conservatory graduate. The cognitive dissonance made his head spin, shattering assumptions he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. The final notes rang out in the sudden silence, hanging in the air like an accusation. Melody's hands remained poised over the keys for a moment before she turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "Well, Mr. Stone," she said quietly, "I believe you made me an offer." Adrian opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. For the first time in his adult life, he was completely, utterly speechless. The silence stretched between them like a live wire, crackling with unspoken implications. Adrian stared at Melody, his mind scrambling to process what had just happened. The woman sitting at his piano, his cleaning woman, had just performed one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire with the skill of a concert pianist. Everything he thought he knew about his carefully ordered world had just been turned upside down. He started to speak, then stopped, his usual eloquence deserting him completely. The woman who had been invisible to him for 8 months was looking at him with those intelligent brown eyes, waiting for his response to her devastating performance. Melody rose from the piano bench with fluid grace, her purple sweater a splash of color against the pristine white and gray of his music room. She moved to collect her cleaning supplies, her expression carefully neutral, but he caught the slight tremor in her hands as she picked up her cloth. "I should finish my work, Mr. Stone," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the earthquake she'd just triggered in his assumptions. "Unless you'd prefer I leave early today." "No, Adrian shook his head, trying to clear the fog of confusion. That was, where did you learn to play like that? But Melody was already moving toward the door, her cleaning caddy in hand. "Thank you for letting me play your beautiful piano, sir. It's been a long time since I've touched keys that fine." She paused at the threshold, not quite looking back at him. "About your offer. I assume you were joking. Men like you don't marry women like me, regardless of what promises they make." The quiet dignity in her voice hit him like a physical blow. Before he could formulate a response, she was gone, leaving him alone with the lingering echoes of Liszt and the uncomfortable realization that he'd just been schooled by someone he'd completely underestimated. Adrian stood in the empty music room, staring at the piano where her hands had just created magic. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed different now, as if her music had somehow changed the very quality of illumination in the space. He moved to the bench and sat down, placing his own hands on the keys she'd just mastered. The notes he pressed were halting, uncertain, barely recognizable fragments of pieces he'd learned as a child before his mother's death had ended his musical education. His fingers felt clumsy and foreign against the ivory, a stark contrast to the liquid grace Melody had displayed just minutes before. How was this possible? The thought circled through his mind like a vulture. A cleaning woman with conservatory-level skills? It didn't fit into any of the neat categories his world operated within. Wealthy people had talent. Poor people had jobs. The lines weren't supposed to blur like this. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to his assistant's number, then hesitated. What exactly would he say? Research my cleaning woman because she just played Liszt better than most professionals? The request would sound insane. Instead, he found himself opening his laptop and typing Melody Brooks Pianist into the search engine. The results that appeared made his breath catch in his throat. Melody Brooks, 25, winner, Juilliard Piano Competition 2021. Rising star, young pianist Melody Brooks dazzles at Carnegie Hall Student Showcase. Juilliard student Melody Brooks selected for European Masterclass program. The articles were 3 years old, but the photos were unmistakable. The same warm brown eyes, the same intelligent face, though younger and filled with hope rather than the quiet resignation he'd seen in his music room. In the pictures, she wore elegant concert attire and held bouquets of flowers, her smile radiant with the joy of someone living their dreams. Adrian scrolled through article after article, piecing together fragments of a story that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. Melody Brooks hadn't just known how to play piano, she'd been on track to become a professional concert pianist. She'd won competitions, earned scholarships, performed in venues he recognized. Then, Abruptly, the articles stopped. No more competition wins. No graduation announcement from Juilliard. No debut album or concert tour announcements. Just silence. What happened to you? The question formed in his mind as he stared at a photo of her at the piano, her hands positioned exactly as they'd been in his music room, her face transformed by the same transcendent focus he'd witnessed. Mr. Stone. His assistant's voice cut through his concentration. Kelly stood in the doorway of his office, tablet in hand, her expression puzzled. Your 10 o'clock board meeting? You're running 20 minutes late. Adrian looked up, disoriented. He'd moved to his office without conscious thought, his laptop open to articles about a woman who'd been invisible to him for 8 months. Cancel it. Sir. Kelly's perfectly styled eyebrows rose in surprise. The Nexus expansion project? You said this meeting was critical. Reschedule. Something's come up. Kelly made a note on her tablet, her expression carefully neutral. In 3 years of working for him, she'd never known Adrian to cancel important meetings for mysterious personal matters. Should I explain the nature of the emergency to the board members? No. Adrian closed his laptop with more force than necessary. Just handle it, Kelly. That's what I pay you for. After she left, Adrian found himself pacing his office like a caged animal. The space that usually felt like a command center now felt suffocating. His floor-to-ceiling windows. He stopped himself. Not floor-to-ceiling. Just tall windows. He was thinking in cliches, his usually sharp mind scattered by a 20-minute encounter that had appended everything he thought he understood. Downstairs, he could hear the soft sounds of Melody continuing her work. Vacuum cleaner humming in the living room. The gentle clink of cleaning supplies being arranged. The normal, everyday sounds of invisible labor that kept his world running smoothly. But nothing felt normal anymore. The woman making those sounds wasn't who he'd thought she was. She carried within her hands the ability to transform silence into beauty, to take the most challenging pieces ever written and make them sing. She had training that cost hundreds of thousands, talent that couldn't be bought, and yet she was cleaning his house for what he probably spent on lunch. Why? The question gnawed at him. What force could drive someone from Carnegie Hall to cleaning houses? What had happened in those missing 3 years between the last concert photo and her first day working in his mansion? Adrian tried to return to his normal routine. He answered emails, reviewed quarterly reports, participated in a conference call with his London office. But his concentration was fractured. Every sound from elsewhere in the house drew his attention. When the vacuum stopped, he wondered what room she was cleaning. When he heard footsteps on the marble, he calculated where she might be based on her usual pattern. At 11:30, the sound stopped completely. Adrian realized she must have finished and left, probably through the service entrance as she always did. He felt an odd sense of loss, as if something important had slipped away before he could properly examine it. He walked back to the music room, drawn by an impulse he didn't fully understand. The space felt different now, charged with the memory of music that had filled every corner. The piano bench was positioned exactly as it had been before, the lid closed, everything returned to its previous state. But the silence no longer felt empty. It felt pregnant with possibility. Adrian sat on the bench and opened the lid, placing his hands on the keys where hers had been. He tried to remember the opening bars of La Campanella, the way her fingers had moved with such confident precision. His own attempt was halting, clumsy, the notes muddy and uncertain. But for the first time in over a decade, he was making music. Not good music, not even recognizable music, but sound that came from intention rather than accident. His mother's photograph seemed to watch him from the living room, and he wondered what she would think of this moment. Her son finally returning to the piano not through joy but through the shock of recognizing talent he'd almost missed entirely. The front gate chimed, indicating a visitor. Adrian's hands stilled on the keys as Kelly's voice carried from the intercom system. "Mr. Stone, there's a woman here to see you. She says she left something behind and needs to retrieve it." His heart rate spiked. "Send her in." Adrian rose from the piano bench, smoothing his suit jacket and checking his reflection in the music room's mirror. He looked composed, professional, every inch the successful businessman. But inside, something had shifted fundamentally. The woman walking back into his house wasn't just his cleaning woman anymore. She was Melody Brooks, mysterious fallen star, keeper of secrets he found himself desperate to understand. The question was, what did she want? And more importantly, what was he prepared to offer to find out? Adrian stood in his foyer, straightening his already perfect tie as he waited for Melody to arrive at the front door. Through the tall windows, he could see San Francisco Bay churning under increasingly dark clouds that had rolled in while he'd been lost in research about her past. The weather matched his internal state, turbulent, unpredictable, charged with electricity. When the doorbell chimed, he opened it himself rather than waiting for Kelly to handle it. Melody stood on his doorstep, no longer in her cleaning clothes but wearing dark jeans and a coral-colored blouse that made her skin glow despite the gray afternoon light. She held a small leather portfolio against her chest like a shield. "Mr. Stone." Her voice was carefully polite, but he caught the tension underneath. "I apologize for disturbing you. I left my sheet music in the music room. I just need to collect it and I'll be out of your way." Sheet music. Of course. In all his shock over her performance, he hadn't noticed what she might have brought with her. Now he found himself curious about what pieces she carried, what music lived in that leather case she held so protectively. "Please, come in." He stepped aside, hyper-aware of her presence as she moved past him into the foyer. She smelled like vanilla and something floral, jasmine, maybe, a warmth that seemed to follow her through his sterile hallways. "I can find my own way," she said, already moving toward the music room. "You don't need to." A flash of lightning illuminated the foyer, followed immediately by a crash of thunder that made them both jump. The lights flickered, and rain began hammering against the windows with the sudden intensity of a Bay Area spring storm. "Jesus," Adrian muttered, moving to look outside. The storm had arrived with shocking speed, transforming the earlier gray clouds into a wall of water that made visibility almost zero. Trees in his garden bent under the wind, and he could see debris flying past the windows. "I should go," Melody said, but her voice lacked conviction as she stared at the tempest outside. "My car." Another lightning strike, closer this time, and the lights went out completely. Emergency power kicked in immediately, but the house felt different in the dim auxiliary lighting. More intimate, less like a museum. "You're not going anywhere in this," Adrian said, his voice carrying automatic authority. "It's not safe." Melody looked torn between accepting his logic and maintaining her distance. She clutched her portfolio tighter, as if the sheet music inside could somehow transport her away from this uncomfortable situation. "The storm will pass," she said. "I can wait in my car until—" "Don't be ridiculous." Adrian moved toward his kitchen, gesturing for her to follow. "I'll make coffee. We can wait it out like civilized people." He didn't wait for her response, leaving her little choice but to follow or stand alone in his darkened foyer. After a moment's hesitation, she trailed behind him, her footsteps soft on the marble floors. The kitchen felt different in the storm's dim light, less sterile, more human. Adrian found himself actually looking at the space as he moved through it, seeing it through Melody's eyes. What must she think of his granite countertops and professional-grade appliances that rarely got used for actual cooking? "Cream. Sugar?" he asked as he started his expensive espresso machine, grateful for something normal to focus on. "Black is fine." Melody perched on one of the bar stools at his island, setting her portfolio carefully beside her. She looked around the kitchen with curious eyes, and he wondered what she was cataloging about his life. "So," Adrian said as the machine hummed to life. "Juilliard." He watched her shoulders stiffen, saw her fingers tighten around the portfolio's edges. The single word hung between them like an accusation. "You researched me. It wasn't a question. I was curious." He kept his tone neutral, but inside he felt oddly guilty about the invasion of privacy. Melody Brooks, rising star. Carnegie Hall. European master classes. Quite impressive credentials for someone cleaning houses. The coffee machine finished its cycle with a soft beep that seemed loud in the sudden quiet. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the windows, but inside the kitchen, everything had gone still. "People's circumstances change, Mr. Stone." Melody's voice was carefully controlled, but he caught the pain underneath. Not everyone gets to live their dreams. Adrian poured 2 cups of coffee, noting how she accepted hers with both hands, as if she needed the warmth. Her fingers were long and elegant, pianist's hands, he realized now. He'd been an idiot not to notice before. What happened? The question came out more gently than he'd intended. The articles just stopped. 3 years ago. Melody stared into her coffee for a long moment, and Adrian thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My father had a heart attack. Massive medical bills. No insurance." She took a sip of coffee, using the movement to hide her expression. Someone had to work. Someone had to choose between dreams and family. The simple words hit Adrian like a physical blow. He thought about his own father, alive and healthy, and still running his investment firm at 72. About the safety net of generational wealth that had never let him fall, never forced him to choose between survival and ambition. Your scholarship doesn't cover living expenses, doesn't pay for emergency flights home or medical bills or keeping food on the table. Melody's voice gained strength, though he could see the cost of these admissions in the tightness around her eyes. "I made it through 3 years before the money ran out. 3 years of the best musical education in the world, and I had to walk away 6 months before graduation." Thunder crashed overhead, and the auxiliary lighting flickered. In the dimness, Adrian could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, though she held them back with fierce determination. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in years. "I had no idea." "Why would you?" Melody looked up at him then, her brown eyes bright with unshed tears and something that might have been anger. "Men like you don't think about the cost of dreams. You don't have to choose between your future and your family's survival." The accusation stung because it was true. Adrian had never faced a choice like that. His dreams had been supported by unlimited resources, and when he'd abandoned music after his mother's death, it had been emotional choice, not financial necessity. "You're right," he said quietly. "I don't understand that kind of choice." Something in his tone seemed to surprise her. She studied his face in the dim light, as if looking for deception or condescension and finding neither. "I've never told anyone that before," she admitted. "About having to leave school. It's easier to let people think I just wasn't good enough." "But you were." Adrian moved around the island to sit beside her, close enough to catch that vanilla and jasmine scent again. "More than good enough. Your performance this morning. I've heard professional concerts that weren't half as moving." Melody turned to look at him, and he realized how close they were sitting. Close enough to see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, close enough to notice the way her lips parted slightly when she was surprised. "Thank you," she whispered. "It's been 3 years since anyone heard me play. I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to share music with someone." The storm raged outside, but inside Adrian's kitchen, something else was building. A different kind of electricity, warm and dangerous and impossible to ignore. He found himself leaning closer, drawn by forces he didn't fully understand. "Play something else," he said softly. "When the storm passes, play something just for yourself." "I don't have anywhere to practice anymore," Melody said, her voice barely audible. "I sold my keyboard 2 years ago to help with Dad's medical bills." The casual mention of such sacrifice made Adrian's chest tighten. This woman had given up everything, her dreams, her career, her very identity as a musician, to save her family. And he'd spent 8 months treating her like furniture. "You have somewhere now," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "You can play here, any time you want." Melody stared at him in shock. "Mr. Stone, I couldn't." "Adrian," he corrected. "And yes, you could. The piano needs to be played. It's been silent too long." Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. Inside, 2 people from completely different worlds sat in the intimate darkness, surrounded by the weight of revealed truths and unexpected possibilities. Sometimes the storms that trap us together are exactly what we need to break down the walls we've built. What would you do if you were stuck with someone who just shattered everything you thought you knew? The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, the wind had intensified, howling around the corners of Adrian's mansion like a living thing demanding entry. In the kitchen's dim emergency lighting, Melody cradled her coffee cup and stared out at the tempest, her reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked windows. "You said the piano has been silent too long," she said quietly, not looking at him. "What did you mean?" Adrian felt his chest tighten. He'd hoped to keep the focus on her story, her pain. His own wounds felt too raw, too private to share with someone he barely knew. But something about the storm's intimacy, about the way she'd trusted him with her sacrifice, made his usual defenses feel suddenly insufficient. "I used to play," he said simply. "A long time ago." Melody turned to study his face in the soft light. "What happened? What happened?" Such a simple question with such a complicated answer. Adrian set down his coffee and walked to the window, pressing his palm against the cool glass. Outside, his perfectly manicured gardens were being destroyed by the storm, expensive landscaping torn apart by forces beyond his control. "My mother taught me," he said, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Classical pieces. Mostly. She said music was the language of the soul, that everything else was just noise." He could feel Melody's attention like a physical weight, patient and understanding in a way that made him want to keep talking despite every instinct screaming at him to stop. She was classically trained too. Royal Academy of Music in London. Could have had a career, but she chose my father instead. Chose the life of a tech executive's wife. Adrian's laugh was bitter. She gave up her dreams for love, and look how that turned out. The words hung between them, loaded with decades of resentment and grief. Adrian had never spoken about his mother to anyone. Not friends, not therapists, not the succession of women who'd tried to get close to him over the years. "She sounds wonderful," Melody said softly. "What was she like?" Adrian closed his eyes, and suddenly he was 16 again, sitting at their old piano, a smaller Steinway they'd had before his father's wealth had exploded into the stratosphere. His mother's hands guiding his fingers across the keys, her voice warm with encouragement even when he struggled with difficult passages. "Music isn't about perfection, Adrian," her voice echoed in his memory. "It's about connection. About saying things with your heart that your words never could." She was. Adrian struggled to find words adequate to capture Elena Stone's essence. Gentle. Patient. She had this way of making everything feel possible, even when my father was working 18-hour days and treating our house like a hotel. He turned back to Melody, surprised by the understanding in her eyes. She wasn't offering empty sympathy or platitudes. She was simply listening, creating space for his pain without trying to fix it. "The piano was our thing," he continued, moving back to sit beside her. "Every day after school, we'd play together. She'd teach me new pieces, or we'd just improvise. Create music that belonged only to us." "She must have been proud of your progress," Melody said, and Adrian could hear the genuine warmth in her voice. "She was." The memory brought both joy and agony. "I was working on Chopin's Ballade No. 1 when—" He stopped, the familiar wall slamming down between his emotions and his words. "When what?" Melody's voice was gentle, but persistent. Adrian stared at his hands, hands that had once moved across piano keys with confidence, that had created beauty under his mother's loving guidance. Now they felt foreign, disconnected from any source of creativity or joy. "When she died," he said flatly. "Cancer. Pancreatic. 6 months from diagnosis to—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, of shared grief that didn't require explanation. When Melody reached over and covered his hand with hers, the touch was warm and electric, sending shock waves up his arm. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "How old were you?" 16. The word came out rough, scraped raw by years of suppressed emotion. "My father." He fell apart. Completely. The man who could run a multi-billion-dollar company couldn't figure out how to talk to his grieving son. Adrian looked down at their joined hands, her dark skin against his pale fingers, the contrast somehow beautiful in the storm's gray light. He couldn't remember the last time someone had touched him with such simple, uncomplicated kindness. "He threw himself into work," Adrian continued, his voice gaining strength from her touch. 18-hour days became 20-hour days. He'd come home and look at me like I was some kind of puzzle he couldn't solve. The piano reminded him of her, so he wanted it gone. I fought him on it, the only real fight we ever had. "You kept it," Melody observed. "I kept it. But I stopped playing." Adrian pulled his hand away, immediately missing her warmth. "Every time I touched the keys, I could hear her voice, feel her presence. It was too much. So I taught myself not to need music, not to need beauty or art or anything that couldn't be quantified and controlled." He stood abruptly, pacing to the other side of the kitchen as if physical distance could somehow contain the emotions threatening to spill over. "I became my father," he said, the admission tasting like ash in his mouth. "Ruthless, focused, successful. Everything he wanted me to be and nothing she would have recognized." The storm outside seemed to echo his internal tempest, lightning illuminating his kitchen in stark, dramatic flashes. In those brief moments of brightness, he could see Melody's reflection in the window, her expression thoughtful and sad. "That's why you bought such an expensive piano," she said, understanding dawning in her voice. "And why you never play it." "Guilt," Adrian confirmed. "The most expensive shrine to failure money could buy." I told myself I was honoring her memory, but really I was just punishing myself for not being strong enough to continue without her. Melody rose from her stool and moved toward him, her footsteps soft on the polished floor. When she stopped just arm's length away, he could smell that vanilla and jasmine scent again, could see the compassion in her eyes that he didn't deserve. "She wouldn't want that," Melody said firmly. "No mother would want her child to stop creating beauty because of grief." "You don't know that," Adrian replied, but even as he said the words, he knew she was right. His mother had believed music was essential to the human soul. She would have been heartbroken to know he'd silenced that part of himself in her memory. "I know because I have a mother too," Melody said, her voice soft but certain. "And when I called her crying the day I had to leave Juilliard, you know what she said? Adrian shook his head, transfixed by the pain and love warring in her expression. She said, "Baby, music doesn't live in schools or concert halls. It lives in your heart. And no circumstance can take that away unless you let it." Melody's eyes brightened with unshed tears. "Your mother's music is still alive in you, Adrian. You've just been too afraid to let it out." The use of his first name, combined with the gentle certainty in her voice, cracked something deep inside his chest. For 18 years, he'd carried the weight of his mother's death like a stone, letting it crush the parts of himself that had brought her joy. "I don't know how to play anymore," he admitted, the words barely a whisper. "I don't know how to feel anything through music except loss." Melody stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. "Then let me teach you," she said, "the way she taught you, with patience and love instead of judgment." The offer hung between them like a lifeline thrown across a chasm of grief and isolation. Adrian stared into her face, this woman who'd revealed her own sacrifices and pain, who was now offering to help him reclaim something he'd thought was lost forever. Outside, the storm began to weaken, though neither of them noticed. Inside Adrian's sterile mansion, something much more powerful was building. A connection forged from shared loss and the tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to let music back into their wounded hearts. The storm had gentled to a steady rainfall by the time Adrian and Melody made their way to the music room. Soft gray light filtered through the tall windows, casting everything in silvery shadows that felt more intimate than harsh daylight. The Steinway waited in the center of the room like a patient friend, its ebony surface gleaming despite the dust Adrian knew had accumulated over the years. "I haven't done this in 18 years, Adrian said, his voice tight with nervous energy as he approached the piano bench. His hands trembled slightly, barely visible, but Melody caught the movement. "Music is like riding a bicycle," she said gently, settling beside him on the bench. The space was designed for one person, forcing them to sit close enough that their shoulders touched. "Your fingers remember more than your mind thinks they've forgotten." Adrian stared at the keys, 88 black and white rectangles that had once been as familiar as his own name. Now they felt foreign, intimidating, like a language he'd once spoken fluently but had forgotten through years of deliberate neglect. "Start simple," Melody suggested, her voice carrying the same patient warmth his mother had once used. "What's the first piece you remember learning?" "For Elise," Adrian replied automatically, then felt a ghost of a smile cross his face. "Every piano student's first real piece. Mom said it was like a rite of passage." "Perfect." Melody's fingers found the opening notes, playing them slowly and clearly. The melody filled the room with bittersweet beauty, each note hanging in the air before dissolving into the next. "Now you try. Just the first few measures." Adrian placed his hands on the keys, his fingers feeling clumsy and uncertain. The first notes came out stilted, mechanical, nothing like the flowing grace Melody had demonstrated. Frustration tightened his jaw. "I sound like a child," he muttered. "You sound like someone who's been away from music for a long time," Melody corrected. "There's a difference." She covered his right hand with hers, guiding his fingers to the correct position. "Feel the weight of the keys. Don't fight them, let them respond to your touch." Her hand on his sent electricity shooting up his arm, but Adrian tried to focus on the instruction rather than the way her skin felt warm and soft against his. Under her guidance, he played the opening phrase again, this time with more fluidity. "Better," Melody said, and he could hear genuine pride in her voice. "Your muscle memory is still there. It just needs time to wake up." They worked through "For Elise" slowly, Melody patiently correcting his fingering and helping him find the rhythm that had once come naturally. Gradually, Adrian felt some of his tension dissolving. The notes began to flow more smoothly, and fragments of his childhood training started surfacing from whatever corner of his mind had kept them safe all these years. "There," Melody said as he completed the entire first section without stopping. "You see. Still a pianist." Adrian looked at his hands on the keys, amazed. For a few minutes, he'd actually been making music again. Not good music, perhaps, but recognizable melodies that carried emotional weight. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. "How do you do it?" he asked, turning to study her profile. "Make it look so effortless?" Melody's fingers found a simple melody in the upper registers, something Adrian didn't recognize but that sounded like sunlight made audible. "Practice," she said simply. "And love. You can't play music you don't love. Not really. The audience always knows when you're just going through the motions." "Is that why you left your old job?" Adrian asked. "Because you didn't love it?" She was quiet for a moment, her fingers still moving across the keys in soft, contemplative phrases. "I never had an old job," she said finally. "When I left Juilliard, I went straight to work. Cleaning houses, waiting tables, whatever paid the bills. This is the longest I've stayed anywhere." The casual mention of her sacrifices hit Adrian like a physical blow. While he'd been building his empire and accumulating wealth beyond most people's dreams, she'd been scrubbing toilets and serving food to make ends meet, all while carrying the weight of her abandoned musical career. "Why here?" he asked. "Why my house?" Melody's hands stilled on the keys. She turned to face him, and Adrian was struck again by the intelligence and depth in her brown eyes. "Because of this," she said, gesturing to the piano. "Because I could dust this beautiful instrument twice a week and pretend, just for a little while, that I was still part of the music world. That must have been torture." "Sometimes," she admitted. "But mostly it was hope. Knowing that somewhere in the world, people were still creating beautiful things. That music was still alive even if I couldn't be part of it." Adrian felt something crack open inside his chest, a protective shell he'd built around his heart that was suddenly proving inadequate against this woman's quiet courage and persistent hope. "Play something for me," he said impulsively. "Something that makes you happy." Melody's face lit up with the first genuinely joyful expression he'd seen from her. Her hands moved to the keys with renewed energy, and suddenly the room filled with the opening notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune. The piece flowed from her fingers like liquid moonlight, each phrase shaped with such exquisite sensitivity that Adrian felt his breath catch in his throat. This wasn't the technical brilliance she displayed with the Liszt earlier. This was something deeper. This was a woman pouring her soul into music, sharing something so intimate and beautiful that Adrian felt like he was witnessing a private conversation between Melody and the composer himself. When the final notes faded into silence, Adrian realized he was gripping the edge of the piano bench to keep his hands from shaking. That was... He struggled to find adequate words. "I've never heard anything so beautiful." Melody's cheeks flushed with pleasure. "It's my favorite piece," she said softly. "When I was at Juilliard, I used to play it late at night when I couldn't sleep. It always made me feel like everything would be okay." "Does it still?" Adrian asked. She considered the question seriously. "Today it does," she said, meeting his eyes. "For the first time in 3 years, playing that piece didn't make me sad about what I'd lost. It made me grateful for what I still have." Something in her voice, in the way she was looking at him, made Adrian's pulse quicken. They were sitting so close he could see the fine texture of her skin, could count the individual lashes framing her expressive eyes. The air between them felt charged with possibility. "Melody," he said, her name feeling both foreign and familiar on his tongue. "Yes." He reached up to touch her face, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek with reverent gentleness. She didn't pull away, didn't tense under his touch. Instead, She leaned slightly into his palm, her eyes fluttering closed for just a moment. "Thank you," he whispered, "for bringing music back into this house. For bringing it back into my life." When she opened her eyes, they were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for letting me play again. For remembering that I'm more than just someone who cleans your house." The confession hung between them, loaded with 3 years of suppressed dreams and 8 months of careful invisibility. Adrian felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it almost knocked him off balance. This woman had been living and working in his world for months, carrying her genius in secret, and he'd been too blind and self-absorbed to see her. "You're so much more," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't contain. "You're extraordinary, Melody. You're the most extraordinary person I've ever met." The words seemed to surprise her. Her lips parted slightly, and Adrian found his gaze drawn to their soft curves. The distance between them felt suddenly insignificant, easily closed with the slightest movement. But before either of them could cross that final inch, the sound of the front door chiming cut through the intimate silence like a blade. They sprang apart, the spell broken, reality crashing back into their precious bubble of connection. "Mr. Stone," Kelly's voice carried from the foyer, professional and concerned. "The storm has passed, and you have the rescheduled board meeting in 30 minutes. Also, there's someone here from the cleaning service asking about their employee." Adrian and Melody stared at each other, the outside world suddenly pressing in on all sides. The magic of the afternoon, the music, the confessions, the growing connection between them, felt fragile and threatened by the return of ordinary life. When two souls start to heal together, the outside world has a way of reminding them why they built walls in the first place. The moment shattered like glass. Adrian and Melody sprang apart on the piano bench, the intimacy of the afternoon evaporating as Kelly's voice carried from the foyer with bureaucratic efficiency. The magic they'd woven through music and shared vulnerability felt suddenly fragile, threatened by the harsh light of ordinary life. "I should go," Melody whispered, gathering her sheet music with trembling hands. The portfolio that had seemed so precious earlier now felt like evidence of something shameful, something that needed to be hidden. "No, wait," Adrian started, but she was already standing, smoothing her coral blouse and avoiding his eyes. "Mr. Stone." Kelly's voice grew closer, accompanied by the sharp click of heels on marble. "The cleaning service representative is quite insistent about speaking with you." Adrian cursed under his breath, torn between his responsibilities and the woman who'd just transformed his understanding of himself. "5 minutes," he called back. "I'll be right there." But when he turned back to Melody, she was already moving toward the music room side door, the service entrance she'd been using for 8 months. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of them. "Melody, please." "This was a mistake," she said, not looking back. "I overstepped. I forgot my place." The words hit Adrian like a physical blow. After everything they'd shared, after the music and the confessions and the moment when he'd almost kissed her, she was retreating back into the role of invisible service worker. "Your place." Adrian's voice rose with frustration. "After what just happened, how can you talk about knowing your place?" Melody paused at the doorway, her shoulders rigid with tension. When she turned back, her eyes were bright with tears she refused to let fall. "Because this is the real world, Adrian. And in the real world, billionaire CEOs don't have relationships with their cleaning women. They don't fall for Juilliard dropouts who scrub toilets to pay their bills." "I don't care about any of that," Adrian said, moving toward her. "What happened here today was beautiful," Melody finished for him. "And completely impossible." Before he could respond, Kelly appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral despite the obvious tension in the room. Behind her stood a woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and a disapproving frown. Mrs. Patterson, owner of Spotless Solutions cleaning service. "Mr. Stone," Kelly said smoothly. "This is Mrs. Patterson. She's concerned about one of her employees who was supposed to finish here hours ago." Mrs. Patterson's sharp eyes took in the scene. Adrian in his expensive suit looking disheveled, Melody with her sheet music clutched against her chest, the two of them standing too close for a professional relationship. Her expression grew even more disapproving. "Miss Brooks," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing working-class employees. "You were scheduled to complete your duties and move on to the Henderson account by noon. It's nearly 2 o'clock. Melody's chin lifted slightly, a flash of the dignity Adrian had come to admire. "I apologize, Mrs. Patterson. The storm made it unsafe to drive, so I waited it out." "In the music room?" Mrs. Patterson's tone suggested she found this explanation highly suspicious. "With Mr. Stone?" The implication hung in the air like poison. Adrian felt a surge of protective anger that made his hands clench into fists. How dare this woman speak to Melody like she was some kind of predator seeking to take advantage of wealthy clients? "Miss Brooks was helping me with a technical issue," Adrian said, his voice carrying the cold authority that had intimidated countless business rivals. "The delay was at my request." Mrs. Patterson's eyes narrowed. "I see. And this technical issue required her to bring her personal sheet music." The question landed like a bomb in the suddenly quiet room. Adrian saw Melody's face go pale, saw her clutch the portfolio tighter against her chest as if it could shield her from the humiliation of exposure. "That's irrelevant," Adrian said sharply. Miss Brooks is an exemplary employee who has apparently forgotten the boundaries of professional service," Mrs. Patterson interrupted. "We've had issues with her before." "What issues?" Adrian demanded, his protective instincts fully engaged. Mrs. Patterson's smile was thin and unpleasant. "Taking liberties with client property, playing their instruments instead of cleaning them, acting above her station." She turned to Melody with undisguised contempt. "Did you think I didn't know? Did you think the other girls wouldn't report your little concerts?" Melody's face flushed with shame and anger. "I never damaged anything. I always completed my work. You were hired to clean, not to play dress-up as some kind of failed musician," Mrs. Patterson snapped. "And now I find you here, in an intimate setting with a client, clearly overstepping every professional boundary we have." "That's enough," Adrian said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You will not speak to her that way in my house." Mrs. Patterson turned her cold gaze on him. "Mr. Stone, I understand that certain types of women can be persuasive when they want something. But I assure you, Miss Brooks is not the innocent party she pretends to be." The accusation hit the room like a slap. Adrian felt his vision actually blur with rage, but before he could respond, Melody spoke up, her voice steady despite the tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Stop," she said quietly. "Just stop." She looked at Adrian, and he saw something breaking in her eyes. Not just hurt, but the death of hope. The fragile connection they'd built over the afternoon was crumbling under the weight of social reality and cruel assumptions. "She's right," Melody said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is exactly what it looks like. A desperate woman taking advantage of a kind man's sympathy." "That's not true," Adrian said fiercely. "That's not what this is." "Isn't it?" Melody's laugh was bitter, broken. "You felt sorry for me, for my tragic story about leaving Juilliard. And I let myself believe that music could bridge the gap between your world and mine." She handed her keycard to Mrs. Patterson with hands that shook only slightly. "I quit. Effective immediately." "Melody, no." Adrian started forward, but she backed away as if his touch would burn her. "Thank you for letting me play your piano, Mr. Stone," she said formally, reverting to the careful distance she'd maintained for 8 months. It was a privilege I won't forget. She turned to leave, and Adrian felt panic claw at his chest. Where are you going? How can I reach you? You can't, Melody said without turning around. And you shouldn't try. We both know this was just a beautiful mistake. With that, she walked out through the service entrance, taking with her the music and hope that had filled his house for one perfect afternoon. Adrian stared at the empty doorway, feeling like his world had just collapsed for the second time in his life. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat. Mr. Stone, I do apologize for this unfortunate situation. I'll have a replacement worker here tomorrow, someone more appropriate. Adrian turned to look at the older woman, and something in his expression made her take a step back. Get out, he said quietly. Sir, get out of my house. Now, before I say something we'll both regret. Mrs. Patterson gathered her dignity and left with Kelly trailing behind her, murmuring apologies. Adrian stood alone in his music room, surrounded by the silence that had defined his life for 18 years. But now, instead of feeling familiar and safe, it felt suffocating. The piano bench where they'd sat together was still warm. The air still carried a faint trace of vanilla and jasmine. And in the terrible quiet, Adrian could hear the echo of Melody's last words. We both know this was just a beautiful mistake. But she was wrong. What they'd shared wasn't a mistake. It was the first real thing he'd felt in years. And he'd just let social pressure and one bitter woman's prejudices destroy it without a fight. The rain outside had stopped completely, leaving only the sound of water dripping from the eaves and Adrian's own ragged breathing in the suddenly empty house. The silence in Adrian's mansion felt different now, not peaceful or controlled, but accusatory. He sat at his piano for hours after Melody left, his fingers occasionally finding fragments of For Elise or Claire de Lune, but every note felt hollow without her presence to give it meaning. The sheet music she'd left behind lay scattered on the bench beside him, pages covered with handwritten notations in her careful script, evidence of a musical mind that never stopped working, even while scrubbing floors and dusting furniture. By evening, Adrian had canceled the rest of his meetings and sent Kelly home early. He couldn't concentrate on quarterly reports or merger proposals when Melody's final words kept echoing in his head. We both know this was just a beautiful mistake. But she was wrong. What they'd shared wasn't a mistake. It was the first authentic connection he'd felt since his mother's death. The first time in 18 years that music had meant something more than painful memory. The first time he'd seen past his own carefully constructed walls to recognize the extraordinary person who'd been invisible in his world for 8 months. He'd failed her. When Mrs. Patterson had attacked Melody with those cruel accusations, when she'd reduced their afternoon of music and vulnerability to something sordid and calculated, Adrian should have done more than just order them out. He should have defended Melody's dignity, her talent, her worth. Instead, he'd let social convention and his own shock paralyze him while the woman he was falling for walked away believing she was nothing more than a beautiful mistake. Adrian stood and moved to the tall windows overlooking the bay, watching the lights of Oakland twinkle in the distance. Somewhere across that water, Melody was probably in her small rented room, believing that she'd overstepped and humiliated herself. The thought made his chest ache with a pain he hadn't experienced since watching his mother fade away in a hospital bed. What would Elena Stone think of her son now? The question surfaced unbidden, carrying with it the weight of 18 years of choices that had led him further and further from the man she'd raised him to be. His mother had believed in the power of music to connect souls, in the importance of seeing beyond surface differences to the beauty within people. She would have been heartbroken by his failure to protect someone as gifted and brave as Melody. But she would have been even more disappointed if he gave up now. Adrian pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found a number he hadn't called in months. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Adrian, it's 11 o'clock at night. Someone better be dead or dying. Hello, Rebecca, Adrian said to his private investigator, a former FBI agent who handled sensitive matters for his company. I need you to find someone for me. This is about a woman, isn't it? Rebecca's tone shifted from annoyed to intrigued. In 10 years of working for you, you've never called me about a woman. Her name is Melody Brooks, 28 years old. She was attending Juilliard 3 years ago before she dropped out. Currently living somewhere in the Bay Area, possibly Oakland or Richmond district. What did she do? Steal something? Breach a contract? Adrian closed his eyes, feeling the weight of how this search might look to an outsider. She didn't do anything wrong. I need to find her because I owe her an apology. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Adrian wondered if the call had dropped. When Rebecca finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. Adrian, I have to ask, is this woman trying to extort you? Because if she's threatening to go public with something. No, Adrian said firmly. Nothing like that. He struggled to find words that could encompass what Melody meant to him. She's the most extraordinary person I've ever met, and I let her walk away thinking she didn't matter. Another pause. Okay, I'll see what I can find. But Adrian, if this is what I think it is, you need to be prepared for the consequences. Your board, your investors, the media, they're not going to understand a relationship between you and someone from a different social class. Then they'll have to learn to understand, Adrian said with a conviction that surprised him. Some things are more important than board approval. After ending the call, Adrian wandered through his empty mansion, seeing it through Melody's eyes. The expensive art that impressed no one because no one else lived there to appreciate it. The gourmet kitchen that produced solitary meals consumed in silence. The music room with its magnificent piano that had sat unplayed for years, accumulating dust like a monument to his emotional cowardice. He'd built himself a beautiful prison and called it success. But one afternoon with Melody had shown him what he'd been missing. The joy of creating something beautiful with another person, the electricity of intellectual and artistic connection, the simple human warmth of being truly seen and understood. At 2 a.m., unable to sleep, Adrian found himself back at the piano. This time, instead of struggling through half-remembered pieces, he let his fingers find their own path across the keys. The melody that emerged was halting and imperfect, but it was his, the first original music he'd created since childhood. As he played, he could almost hear his mother's voice. Music isn't about perfection, Adrian. It's about connection. By morning, Adrian had made his decision. Whatever it took, however long it required, he was going to find Melody Brooks and prove to her that what they'd shared was real. Not a moment of weakness or a beautiful mistake, but the beginning of something that could transform both their lives. Rebecca called at 8 a.m. with preliminary information. Your Melody Brooks is harder to track than most people, she said. No permanent address on file, pays rent in cash, works for multiple cleaning services under different names. Classic pattern for someone trying to stay invisible. But you found her? I found her family address in Oakland. Parents, Robert and Diana Brooks. The father had a major heart attack 3 years ago. Massive medical bills that would explain why she left school. They're still at the same address. Adrian felt a surge of hope mixed with nervousness. Thank you, Rebecca. Adrian. Rebecca's voice carried a warning. Whatever you're planning to do, think it through carefully. Grand gestures can backfire spectacularly if they're not what the other person actually wants. What do you mean? I mean that showing up at her family's house unannounced might feel romantic to you, but it could feel invasive and overwhelming to her. Especially if she's dealing with financial stress and family responsibilities. Sometimes the best way to show someone you care is to respect their boundaries, even when it's the last thing you want to do. Adrian sat with that advice as he dressed for what would normally be another day of meetings and profit margins. But nothing about today felt normal. For the first time in his adult life, he was preparing to make a choice based purely on his heart rather than his head. The business world he'd mastered suddenly felt irrelevant compared to the terrifying prospect of laying his soul bare to a woman who had every reason to reject him. By 10 a.m., Adrian was standing in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie and trying to decide what a billionaire CEO wore when he was about to grovel for forgiveness from the woman he'd fallen in love with. Everything in his closet screamed wealth and privilege. Exactly the barriers that had driven Melody away in the first place. Finally, he chose simple dark jeans and a navy sweater, clothes that made him look less like a corporate executive and more like the man who'd sat beside her at the piano, fumbling through For Elise, while she patiently guided his hands back to the keys. The drive to Oakland felt like traveling to another country. Adrian's Tesla looked absurdly expensive on the working-class streets where Melody had grown up, a rolling advertisement for everything that separated their worlds. But as he pulled up to the modest two-story house where the Brooks family lived, Adrian realized that crossing those barriers was exactly what love required. Now came the hardest part, finding the right words to convince Melody that what they'd shared was worth fighting for, worth the social complications and personal risks, worth choosing love over the safety of staying in their separate worlds. The Brooks family house sat on a tree-lined street where children's bicycles leaned against front porches and neighbors knew each other's names. Adrian parked his Tesla a block away, not wanting to announce his arrival with a display of wealth that would only emphasize the gulf between his world and Melody's. The morning air carried the scent of jasmine from someone's garden, and he found himself thinking of how that same fragrance had clung to Melody's hair yesterday when they'd sat together at his piano. The house itself was small but well-maintained, with bright yellow paint that spoke of pride despite modest means. A ramp had been built beside the front steps, likely for Melody's father during his recovery, and flower boxes beneath the windows overflowed with purple and white petunias. Everything about the place radiated the kind of warmth and life that Adrian's mansion, for all its expensive perfection, completely lacked. Adrian stood on the sidewalk for a full minute, gathering courage he'd never needed for boardroom negotiations or million-dollar deals. His hands shook slightly as he approached the front door, and he realized this was the most terrified he'd been since watching his mother die. Before he could knock, the door opened. A woman in her 50s with Melody's warm brown eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple bun looked out at him with curious concern. "Can I help you?" Diana Brooks asked, her voice carrying the same musical quality he'd heard in her daughter's speech. "Mrs. Brooks? My name is Adrian Stone. I'm looking for Melody. I need to speak with her about yesterday." Recognition dawned in Diana's expression, followed quickly by a protective wariness that reminded Adrian painfully of Melody's retreat from intimacy. "You're the man she cleans house for. The one with the piano." "Yes, ma'am." Adrian felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Is she here?" "I know I have no right to ask, but I need to apologize to her. I need to tell her." "She's not here," Diana interrupted, but not unkindly. "She left early this morning for a job interview in the city. Some hotel needs housekeeping staff." Adrian's heart sank. Another cleaning job. Another place where Melody would hide her extraordinary gifts behind invisible service work, where her Juilliard training would remain a secret shame rather than a source of pride. "Mrs. Brooks," he said urgently, "I know this sounds insane, and I know you have every reason not to trust me, but your daughter is the most remarkable person I've ever met. What happened yesterday? It wasn't what that awful woman made it seem. Melody wasn't taking advantage of anything. She was saving me." Diana studied his face with a kind of perception that came from decades of reading people's true intentions. "Saving you from what?" "From a life without music, without beauty, without—" Adrian struggled to find words adequate to the transformation Melody had sparked in him. "Without love." The simple honesty of the admission seemed to surprise Diana. She stepped back slightly, opening the door wider. "Maybe you should come in. Robert's at physical therapy, but I think we need to talk." Adrian followed her into a living room that was everything his wasn't. Lived in, comfortable, filled with family photos and well-loved furniture that had clearly hosted decades of conversations and celebrations. A battered upright piano sat against one wall, its bench topped with stacks of sheet music in Melody's careful handwriting. "That was her piano growing up," Diana said, noticing his gaze. "Bought it used when she was 7 and showed interest in our church piano. She practiced on that thing for hours every day, dreaming of concert halls and Carnegie Hall." "She made it to Carnegie Hall," Adrian said softly. "I saw the articles. She was extraordinary even then." Diana's expression softened slightly. "She was. Even when she was little, music just poured out of her. Like she was translating something the rest of US couldn't hear." "What happened when she left school?" Adrian asked gently. Diana was quiet for a moment, her fingers absently straightening sheet music that didn't need straightening. "Robert's heart attack was massive. 6 surgeries, months in intensive care, rehabilitation that's still ongoing. Our insurance." She shook her head. "Let's just say it wasn't adequate for what he needed." "So Melody came home." "She came home," Diana confirmed. "Wouldn't hear of us declaring bankruptcy or losing the house. Said her education could wait, but family couldn't. She's been working multiple jobs ever since, sending us money, paying medical bills, acting like her sacrifice was nothing." Adrian felt that familiar ache in his chest, the same protective fury he'd experienced watching Mrs. Patterson's cruelty yesterday. "She shouldn't have had to choose." "No, she shouldn't have. But that's not the world we live in." Diana turned to face him fully. "Now tell me, Mr. Stone, what exactly happened yesterday that has you showing up at my door looking like a man whose heart got torn out?" Adrian found himself telling Diana everything. The music challenge that had started as arrogant condescension, Melody's stunning performance that had shattered his assumptions, the storm that had trapped them together, the tentative connection that had grown through shared vulnerabilities and music. He told her about his mother's death, about the 18 years of silence he'd imposed on himself, about how Melody's patient teaching had brought music back into his life. And he told her about Mrs. Patterson's cruelty, about his failure to defend Melody adequately, about how she'd walked away believing she was nothing more than a beautiful mistake. When he finished, Diana was quiet for a long time. "You love her," she said finally. "It wasn't a question." "I do," Adrian admitted. "I know how that sounds. We barely know each other. We're from completely different worlds. But yesterday, when she played your piano and taught me to feel music again, I've never experienced anything like that connection. And what exactly are you planning to do about it?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications about social barriers, financial differences, and the 1,000 practical obstacles that stood between a billionaire CEO and a woman working multiple cleaning jobs to support her family. "I don't know," Adrian said honestly. "But I know I can't let her disappear into another invisible job, believing that her dreams don't matter. She deserves to have her music heard. She deserves to finish what she started at Juilliard." Diana's eyebrows rose. "And you think your money can solve everything?" "No," Adrian said quickly. "I think my money is irrelevant. What matters is that she knows someone sees her worth, someone believes in her talent. Whether she wants anything to do with me or not, she should have the chance to reclaim her dreams." Something in his tone seemed to satisfy Diana. She studied his face for another long moment, then moved to the old piano and pulled out a sheet of paper from beneath the music. "The interview she went to this morning," Diana said, handing him the paper. "It's at the St. Francis Hotel downtown. If you really want to find her, if you really want to prove that yesterday wasn't just some rich man's momentary fascination with playing savior to a poor girl, you'll have to do better than showing up here with good intentions. Adrian looked at the paper, a job listing for housekeeping positions at one of San Francisco's most prestigious hotels. The irony wasn't lost on him that Melody was probably at this very moment in another interview, preparing to clean rooms for wealthy guests who would never see her as anything more than part of the furniture. "What do you mean?" he asked. Diana smiled, and for the first time, Adrian saw where Melody had inherited her quiet strength and fierce dignity. "I mean that grand gestures are easy for people with your resources. What's hard is showing up consistently, respecting her choices even when they're not what you want, and proving that your feelings for her aren't dependent on her gratitude or her willingness to be rescued." "How do I do that?" You start by asking yourself what Melody needs, not what makes you feel better about yesterday. Diana's voice was kind but firm. And then you find a way to give her that, even if it means stepping back and letting her choose her own path. Adrian felt the weight of her wisdom, the challenge implicit in her words. Loving Melody wasn't about rescuing her or using his wealth to solve her problems. It was about seeing her as she truly was, a woman of extraordinary talent and strength who deserved the freedom to reclaim her dreams on her own terms. "Thank you," he said, tucking the job listing into his pocket, "for trusting me with her story, for helping me understand." "Don't thank me yet," Diana said, walking him to the door. "Thank me when you figure out how to love my daughter without trying to save her." As Adrian drove back toward the city, Diana's words echoed in his mind. The St. Francis Hotel rose before him like a challenge, its elegant facade hiding the reality that somewhere inside, Melody was probably sitting in another sterile interview room, preparing to make herself invisible once again. But Adrian had learned something crucial from her mother. Love wasn't about grand gestures or financial solutions. It was about seeing someone fully and supporting their dreams without trying to control the outcome. The question was, how could he show Melody that she was worth fighting for without making her feel like another problem to be solved with his money? The answer, when it came to him, was so simple and so perfect that he almost laughed out loud. He pulled out his phone and made a call that would either change everything or cost him the woman he loved forever. But some risks, he was finally learning, were worth taking. Adrian sat in his Tesla outside the St. Francis Hotel for 20 minutes, watching well-dressed guests enter and exit through the revolving doors. Somewhere inside that elegant building, Melody was probably sitting across from a hiring manager, trying to convince them she was qualified to clean the rooms of people who would never see her as anything more than a uniformed ghost moving through their lives. The phone call he'd made had set wheels in motion that couldn't be stopped. In 6 hours, everything would change, either spectacularly well or catastrophically badly. But first, he had to find Melody and do something he'd never done in his adult life. Admit he'd been completely wrong and ask for a second chance he didn't deserve. Adrian entered the hotel's opulent lobby, feeling overdressed despite his casual clothes. The space dripped with old San Francisco money, crystal chandeliers, marble floors, gold leaf details that spoke of a time when elegance mattered more than efficiency. He approached the concierge desk, where a silver-haired man in an immaculate uniform looked up with professional politeness. "Good afternoon, sir. How may I assist you? I'm looking for someone who's interviewing for a housekeeping position today. Melody Brooks. It's urgent, a family emergency." The concierge's expression shifted to concern. "Of course, sir. Let me check with human resources." He made a quick phone call, speaking in hushed tones before hanging up. "Miss Brooks just finished her interview. She's in the employee break room on the 3rd floor, gathering her things." Adrian's heart hammered against his ribs as he took the elevator up, practicing words that felt inadequate for everything he needed to say. The break room was a stark contrast to the hotel's public luxury. Fluorescent lighting, plastic chairs, vending machines humming in the corner. And there, sitting alone at a small table, was Melody. She looked exhausted, her coral blouse slightly wrinkled, her sheet music portfolio clutched in her lap like a shield. When she saw him standing in the doorway, her eyes widened with surprise that quickly hardened into wariness. Adrian! His name on her lips sounded like an accusation. What are you doing here? I came to apologize, he said, not moving from the doorway. And to ask you to come with me. Come with you where? Melody's voice was carefully neutral, but he could see the hurt she was trying to hide. To another afternoon of playing piano before reality sets in again? To Davies Symphony Hall, Adrian said quietly. There's something there you need to see. Melody stared at him for a long moment. I just got offered a job, Adrian. A good job with benefits and regular hours. I can't afford to play games with my future anymore. I'm not asking you to play games. Adrian stepped into the room, his voice urgent. I'm asking you to trust me one more time. Just for tonight. If you don't like what I have to show you, I'll drive you home and never bother you again. Something in his tone must have reached her because Melody's rigid posture softened slightly. Why Davies Hall? Because that's where you belong, Adrian said simply. Not cleaning hotel rooms or dusting pianos in empty mansions. On stage, sharing your gift with people who can appreciate its beauty. Melody's laugh was bitter. You think it's that easy? You think I can just walk onto a concert stage after 3 years of cleaning houses and pretend I never left? No, Adrian said, moving closer. I think you're the most talented musician I've ever heard. And I think the world deserves to know that. But more than that, I think you deserve to know it too. For a moment, something flickered in Melody's eyes. Hope, maybe, or longing. Then the walls went back up. I can't afford dreams anymore, Adrian. Some of us have responsibilities. What if those responsibilities could be handled without sacrificing your dreams? Before Melody could respond, Adrian's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and felt his pulse quicken. Everything was in place. Please, he said, meeting her eyes. Just come with me. 2 hours. If you hate what you see, I'll never ask you for anything again. Melody studied his face for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she stood, gathering her portfolio. 2 hours. But Adrian, if this is some kind of pity gesture, some rich man's idea of charity, I'll never forgive you. It's not pity, Adrian said softly. It's love. The concert hall was ablaze with lights when Adrian and Melody arrived, its Art Deco facade glowing against the evening sky. Elegant patrons in evening were streamed through the entrance, chattering excitedly about the evening's performance. Melody stared up at the building she'd dreamed of performing in since childhood, confusion clear on her face. Adrian, what's going on? There's obviously a concert tonight, and we're not dressed for. We're not going to watch, Adrian said, taking her hand. We're going backstage. He led her around to the artist's entrance, where a security guard nodded in recognition and waved them through. The backstage area buzzed with pre-concert energy. Musicians warming up, stage crew making final adjustments, the controlled chaos that preceded every great performance. Adrian, we shouldn't be here, Melody whispered, but her eyes were bright with fascination as they passed practice rooms where world-class musicians prepared for the evening ahead. Actually, we should, said a warm voice behind them. They turned to see a distinguished woman in her 60s approaching. Her silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, her black concert dress simple but clearly expensive. You must be Melody. I'm Catherine Chen, artistic director of the San Francisco Symphony. Melody's mouth fell open. Catherine Chen was a legend in the classical music world, a former concert pianist who'd become one of the most respected conductors on the West Coast. Ms. Chen, I don't understand. Mr. Stone contacted me this afternoon, Catherine explained, her eyes twinkling with amusement. He sent me recordings of your performance from yesterday, along with copies of your Juilliard transcripts and competition recordings. Quite impressive credentials, Miss Brooks. Recordings. Melody turned to stare at Adrian. You recorded me? Adrian's cheeks flushed. I have a security system. Audio recording in every room. I wanted to hear your playing again, to make sure I wasn't imagining how extraordinary it was. That's a violation of privacy, Melody said, but her voice lacked real anger. It's also how I knew I wasn't crazy, Adrian replied. How I knew that what I heard yesterday was real. Catherine stepped between them with practiced diplomacy. Miss Brooks, I have a proposition for you. Our scheduled soloist for tonight's concerto came down with food poisoning 2 hours ago. I need someone who can perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with minimal rehearsal. Melody went pale. Ms. Chen, I couldn't possibly. You performed it at your Juilliard senior recital, Catherine continued smoothly. I have the recording. You were magnificent then, and based on what Mr. Stone shared with me today, you've only grown as an artist. But I haven't performed publicly in 3 years, Melody protested. I haven't even practiced seriously. I'm not prepared for. The San Francisco Symphony doesn't need you to be perfect, Catherine said gently. We need you to be authentic, to share your gift with an audience that's hungry for real artistry. Adrian watched Melody's face, seeing the war between hope and fear playing out in her expression. You don't have to decide right now, he said softly. But the piano is tuned, the orchestra is ready, and there are 1,500 people in that hall who are about to hear something extraordinary if you're brave enough to share it. Melody looked back and forth between them, her hands trembling slightly. Why? She whispered. Why are you doing this? Because yesterday, when you played Liszt in my music room, you gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever, Adrian said. Because you deserve to have your music heard by people who understand its value. And because... He took a deep breath. Because I made you a promise. I said if you could play Liszt, I'd marry you. I may have been joking then, but I'm not joking now. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning impossible distances. Melody's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for 3 years. Tears for dreams deferred, for sacrifices made, for the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to reclaim the life she'd thought was lost forever. The audience is waiting, Catherine said gently. What do you say, Miss Brooks? Are you ready to come home? Melody closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, Adrian saw something he'd never witnessed before. Melody Brooks, concert pianist, fully inhabiting her own power. I'll need 10 minutes to warm up, she said, her voice steady with new resolve. And I'll need someone to call my parents. They should be here for this. Catherine's smile was radiant. Already taken care of. Mr. Stone arranged for them to be picked up an hour ago. They're in the family box. As if summoned by her words, Diana and Robert Brooks appeared in the hallway, Diana's eyes bright with tears of pride, Robert leaning on a walker but beaming with joy. They embraced their daughter fiercely, whispering words of love and encouragement that made Adrian's chest tight with emotion. You did this, Melody said, turning to Adrian as her parents were led to their seats. All of this. I made some phone calls, Adrian said modestly. But the music, the talent, the courage to walk out on that stage, that's all you. Melody stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her vanilla and jasmine scent, could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes that had captivated him from the beginning. If I do this, she said softly, if I walk out there and play, what happens after? What happens to us? Adrian cupped her face in his hands. marveling at the trust she was showing by allowing his touch. "Whatever you want to happen. If you want to return to school, I'll make sure your family is taken care of while you finish your degree. If you want to launch a concert career, I'll support that in any way I can. And if you want nothing to do with me after tonight, I'll respect that too. And if I want all of that, plus you?" Adrian's heart stopped. "Then you'll have me, for as long as you'll have me. Not as your patron or your savior, but as someone who loves you exactly as you are and wants to spend his life listening to the music you create." Melody stood on her tiptoes and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, she was smiling through her tears. "I have one condition," she said. "Anything." Next month, when the San Francisco Chronicle reviews this performance, I want them to mention that Melody Brooks is engaged to Adrian Stone. Not because he rescued her, but because she chose him. Adrian's answering smile felt like it might split his face in half. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes to everything," Melody said, then turned toward the stage entrance where Catherine was waiting with barely contained excitement. As Melody walked toward the stage that would mark her return to the musical world, Adrian followed at a respectful distance. From the wings, he watched her settle at the Steinway Grand, a twin to the one in his music room where this whole love story had begun. The orchestra rose as she entered, and the audience's applause was warm and welcoming. When the first notes of Rachmaninoff's concerto filled the hall, Adrian felt tears on his cheeks. This wasn't just Melody reclaiming her dreams. This was the sound of two wounded souls choosing love over fear, choosing connection over isolation, choosing to believe that music really could bridge any distance between hearts. In the family box, he could see Diana and Robert Brooks holding hands, their faces radiant with pride. And on stage, bathed in golden light, Melody transformed the air itself into liquid beauty, her fingers dancing across keys that responded to her touch like old friends welcoming her home. The music soared and dove, whispered and roared, telling the story of everything they'd been through and everything they'd found in each other. And when the final notes faded into thunderous applause, Adrian knew that this was just the beginning of a love story that would last a lifetime. As Melody took her bows, her eyes found his in the wings. She mouthed 3 words that made his heart soar: "I love you." And in that moment, Adrian Stone, billionaire CEO, master of the universe, man who'd thought he had everything, finally understood what it meant to be truly wealthy. Music really is the language of the soul, and sometimes the most beautiful melodies are born from the courage to love beyond all barriers. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.